Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is the useful human, Mr. Arif San. Arif, let's talk before we hit the mailbag. How did the consensus board do this year?
In terms of predicting the draft, I think it did better than it does most years, and most years it does really, really well. In the first two rounds, we only had two players, or the first three rounds, I think. We had only two players drafted outside of the consensus board top 200, which very rarely happens. I'm still traumatized by Kwesi Williams, the Jaguars' second, maybe third round pick linebacker, who is related to Quinnen Williams and went to, I want to say, Murray State. I just did not have him in my database. And so very early on, we had somebody who was not in the consensus board at all, much less in the top 300. This year, we didn't really have much of that. It was very concentrated in terms of, players at the top. You ended up with, I want to say 20 players that, about 12 players that were not on my top 570. That was just an input error. So live during the draft, I went back into my database and found them and regraded and put them back into the big board. It never changed the top 300, luckily. But it just, in terms of having all of the players that were drafted, this is the best year it had in terms of getting players in the top 300 drafted in the top 262, which was how many picks there were. I thought it did, relatively speaking, spectacularly. I'll do a kind of a more thorough analysis later, but by the time I do that, no one cares about the consensus board. So it's always going to be saved for next year's pieces on the consensus board.
How did you feel about that? And, a lot's been written about the draft, so we realize this is a couple days after the fact, after most of the opinion pieces have come out. How did you feel about the reach that the Patriots made in the first round? What did the board think? Because the more we talk about it, sounds like the board is sentient.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what Dropplay Dave was worried about, that the board had gained its own understandings and opinions and whatnot. The board thought it was an awful pick. The thing is, when you see it, people will defend it online. You don't know that guy could have gone later, and it's true, we don't. But this is one circumstance. So apparently there's a quote floating around from a piece from somebody covering the Patriots, saying that the Patriots were worried that if they waited until the second round, he wouldn't be there. Duh. Obviously, I know that they thought that because they drafted him in the first round. That is not take a genius. But the fact that we actually finally got insight from a team on this, accidentally, mind you, when the Rams held their, draft party, my understanding is that it actually was really cool. But they were commenting live on the players that were drafted and stuff like that. And when Cole Strange got drafted, Sean McVay said, "Wow, that's somebody that we thought we were going to get at 104. And they weren't insulting either Cole Strange or the New England Patriots. What McVay was trying to get across was, I can't believe we spent all this time, what fools we are for having spent all this time on this guy thinking he'd be available. But it still did reveal that at least one NFL team thought that, you would have been within striking distance. Now, the consensus board doesn't agree with that either. Yeah, it thought he was maybe at best a second round guy. He's ranked 76th, which is, of course, in the third round, but that is the kind of stretch that you make in the second round that is fairly doable, right? It was one of the worst picks of the first round. The only other worst pick was, of course, the very first pick, at least according to the consensus board, where Trayvon Walker, the 8th ranked player, went first. That is a bigger drop off in value than 29 to 76. And if you don't believe me, look at how much it would take to trade from 76 to 29 versus how much it takes to trade from 8 to 1. It just is more, according to the NFL. So those were the two biggest value losses. Of course, no one was surprised by the Trayvon Walker stuff because it had been reported for a couple of days heading in to the draft, and it turned into the Vegas favorite right away on the day of the draft. I think the morning of the draft. So there was a couple of hours to get used to the Trayvon Walker stuff. But he had been in there in mock drafts for a couple of days now, so everyone was kind of primed for it. And B, it just feels like, hey, sometimes you just got to reach on a guy, right? Like it wasn't quite the same as Cleveland Farrell, who was ranked 29th and drafted 4th or something like that. I think he was 29th. It was still, if you traded down from 1st to 8th and all you got back was a 7th round pick, everyone would be mad, right? It takes a lot to trade from 8 to 1, a lot. That's basically what the Jaguars did. They traded down to 8 without getting anything in return. So those were the two biggest kind of stretches. But the Cole Strange one, I think, was the one that everybody was like shocked by, right? Like, and Cam Jurgens was almost universally considered a better center by analysts, and he went like 30 picks later. So very strange behavior there.
Well, it wasn't even the only like really strange one, because the quarterback who dropped and kept dropping and was even invited to come out to like come out to the draft and didn't get picked up the second day. Like,
Matt Corral was also invited. So I know you're talking about Malik Willis, but Matt Corral was also invited to the draft and also did not get selected until the 3rd day. So you have both of them, right? But yeah, Malik Willis, there was some talk about him getting drafted at number 2 overall. And what's interesting is like the board is so generous to teams that need a quarterback that pick a quarterback. Like the board loves it when you pick a quarterback, and they love it even more if you need one, right? There is a significant boost for drafting players at positions of need, and a significant boost based off of the position that you draft, based off of the historical values that are given to that position, right? And so quarterbacks tend to get more draft investment than any other position, so they have the most draft value according to the board's grading system, right? And so if you happen to need one, now you get a double bonus. Even then, if the Lions had drafted Malik Willis 2nd overall, the board would have said that was a reach, right? So there was still something about, even by the way experts were looking at this, they didn't. So this is worth like a good kind of discussion or after action report from draft analysts for why they collectively ranked Malik Willis 29th or 28th overall. In fact, he was QB1, right? Kenny Pickett was QB2. But they ranked Malik Willis 28th overall. They ranked Desmond Ridder 42nd overall. They ranked Matt Corral 44th overall. Obviously, they all went much later than that. In fact, Desmond Ridder was the 2nd quarterback off the board at 74. It wasn't until 86 that Malik Willis went, and he went to the Tennessee Titans, who do not currently, as far as I know, need a quarterback as much as I like to bag on Ryan Tannehill. They're fine at quarterback, right? Now receiver, different question, but hey, maybe they drafted Malik Willis to be a receiver. That'd be fun and insulting. That would create a lot of discourse. But yeah, and I think that there just has to be kind of like an accounting. And the thing is, it's not like a bunch of bloggers did this and were wrong. The forecaster board had Malik Willis ranked even higher at 23, right? It's not just like a bunch of third-party draft analysts, which, by the way, a lot of them have worked for teams in the past. Like a lot of people say, hey, if these guys were so good, they'd be working for NFL teams. And like, guess what? A lot of them did. And they weren't fired. They left, right? Like, that's what I think a lot of people don't get. They either have been trained by NFL scouts or NFL teams, or have worked for NFL teams, right? Or have had to turn down NFL teams for scouting jobs because it doesn't fit their lifestyle or their pay, right? Because NFL teams pay scouts nothing, right? They pay them very little, right? And so there is something here of where evaluators, again, remember the consensus board sometimes will outperform the NFL. It is not just a bunch of randoms, right? And so it is surprising that Malik Willis didn't get drafted until the 3rd round, right? That Matt Corral didn't get drafted until the 3rd round, right? That is genuinely surprising based off of the information that we had. I would hypothesize, and I wouldn't be shocked if I was wrong, but this is the closest I can get to it, is that there is a misplaced understanding at the very fine, detailed level about what the NFL perceives as fixable in a high-ceiling prospect and not fixable in a high-ceiling prospect, which is why you had a lot of range on, what's his name, the Tyree Jackson, the quarterback for the University of Buffalo that ended up actually going to the Buffalo Bills behind his comp, Josh Allen, although he was 6'7", and Josh Allen was like 6'5". And they like pretty similar, giant arms, incredible arms, really good athletes, great build, really inaccurate, right? So what was the difference between the two? Well, there's a lot of differences. Like Josh Allen read the field a little bit better. But more importantly, I think, and again, I'm guessing, the release, Tyree Jackson's release was agonizingly slow, and that really matters at the NFL level. Josh Allen's wasn't, and that's typically seen as very difficult to fix. That might play a role in terms of why these high ceiling quarterbacks that typically would go in the first or second round wouldn't go there. Is the things they need to fix are actually more difficult to fix, right? And so I think that's part of it. Part of it's also when you have a weak quarterback class, and all you're doing is watching these bad quarterbacks, it becomes kind of easy to just kind of push them up the board a little bit, right? You're like, well, it's if you're not going to get Malik Willis, then you're stuck with like Sam Howell later on or something like that. So, compared to Sam Howell, Malik Willis is at least a second rounder, right? And Sam Howell is like a fourth rounder, right? So there's some of that. It was also kind of a weak draft class in general, just like broadly speaking. So there's some of that. But yeah, it's just like really weird that we had to watch all these quarterbacks fall. So besides Kenny Pickett, watch all these quarterbacks fall so much.
Well, let's get into the mailbag. The first question of the mailbag is going to be from Ed Donatello, who asks, is it time to retire the idea that Kwesi is an analytics GM?
I don't think so. He certainly found value in somebody credibly accused of sexual assault, right? So that seems like a very finance bro decision. But also, I don't just because he made a trade that was against the market doesn't mean that he didn't make a trade that improved the Vikings' odds of winning, right? And so if the question is about the fact that a lot of people thought he got fleeced in the Lions trade, that doesn't really make sense, right? Beyond that, he still prioritized positions that matter to analytics people. His first two picks were a safety and a cornerback, right? And on defense, analytics people consider those to be, I shouldn't say analytics people as if they've got this one hive mind, but the most recent publicly available research that we have from Pro Football Focus tells us that safety and quarterbacks are actually more important in determining the outcomes of a defense than defensive ends and defensive linemen, despite the fact that the Vikings very much needed defensive linemen, could have used a developmental defensive end to replace Darius Smith long term. So I don't think so, right? And then on top of that, Louis Cine, has good metrics. He's got really good production. He's got a really high tackle share. He's got a pretty good pass deflection share. He's got a pretty good PFF score, right? He's got a pretty good yards allowed per snap and coverage, right? Even after you account for team strength, that's all pretty good. So no, and there's some elements again that we'll talk about in a second, where it very much seemed like the picks that they made were in line with data and research that would suggest that these players might have an edge versus similarly graded traits-based players. So I don't think so. I think that even with the one trade, it was kind of whatever.
Next question is going to be from Bill Botke, who asks, it appears the Vikings adopted an intriguing strategy for this draft. First, they tried to maximize the number of picks they could get in the sweet spot of the draft, where surplus value was high, according to Risky of PFF. Next, they tried to select players that were extremely athletic, even if they were moderately lower on the consensus board than other picks. Using Arif's spreadsheet skills, is it possible to test this strategy against previous drafts to see if it makes sense? If not, what does Arif think of the strategy? Could Kwesi be trying out a new version of Moneyball for football?
So let's assume for a second that it is a pretty viable strategy. I would say that he could be trying a Moneyball for football, and fine, that's great. In order to do that successfully, I still think that you need to find ways to maximize your returns on these trades. And so maybe he should have traded down twice in the first round if the Lions offer was the only, giving up that second round pick in that trade is what people were shocked by, right? Now, if the Vikings don't get 34, right? If they just get 66 and there's no exchange between 34 and 46, that ends up coming out to win for the Vikings, but the Vikings very much wanted to pick around 34, and the Lions had that 34th pick, and the only way they could make up the difference was 46. The Vikings probably should have demanded, in addition, a fourth or a fifth, right? That is kind of the issue there, is that you're kind of losing a little bit of that value. Plus, if you had demanded a fourth or a fifth, you would have been able to more easily move up into the 40s with Andrew Booth to get Andrew Booth, and then still have an additional pick in the fourth round to be able to draft somebody like Amari Barno or something like that could kind of better deal with the plethora of holes that the Vikings have, at least long term. So yeah, I think so. Second, I can test it, but my data is just not going to be as robust as Timo Risk's data. And I'll link the PFF stuff on that. For now, I'm just going to trust it. When I have the capacity to combine, and I've done this in the past to judge draft classes, when I have the capacity to have the time to combine something like approximate value and PFF scores and whatever to try to get a true understanding of player value and test it against that, I can see kind of whether or not that area of the draft actually does make sense to kind of localize on. But it does kind of make sense, right? Because there is a little bit of extra value attached to the 20s from a draft trade standpoint, but in terms of player drop-off, from the 20s to the 40s is not as dramatic as I think that the trade charts would suggest. So there is probably something there. The thing is, the thing that matters is the above replacement portion of wins above replacement, because you can actually keep doing that for different sections and chunks of the draft all the way down. But you have to subtract the value of a replacement level player that you can find on the street as a free agent out of it. Otherwise, the sweet spot of the draft might actually be in the middle of the fifth round, right? And you don't really want to maximize your picks there. Even though you've got a ton of value versus fourth round, if you're not subtracting out the above replacement. But from my understanding, yeah, that is actually a pretty smart area of the draft to target if you're not targeting a quarterback. If you are, you should be at the top of the draft if there are quarterbacks that are that valuable.
Let's go to Nate, who asks, I think the Vikings have gone to a grading system similar to PFF. Majority of their draft picks have high PFF 2021 grades. Chandler, Lowe, Naylor, Atueo, Booth, Seen are all 74 plus in their 2021 grades. Ingram, 82.6 in pass blocking. So my question with that is, do you think Kwesi brought over a new type of grading system that was more modern to utilize while watching the game tape, so that he can incorporate these grades into whatever type of consensus board they built / use for this draft?
I don't think so. So a lot of teams will buy access to Pro Football Focus's suite of tools, which includes the ability to procure and produce game film based off of situations. So, for example, one of the really excellent elements that is only offered to teams using the Pro Football Focus data is that you can look for all third downs that a quarterback faced that had 5+ pass rushers in the fourth quarter, right? And you can immediately pull up all of the game film of the plays that satisfy that criteria. It is a remarkably useful system. You can look at every play action pass. You can look at every play action pass that took longer than 3 seconds. You can look at every play action pass that took longer than 3 seconds that did not have any pressure. You can look at every play action pass that took longer than 3 seconds that did not have any pressure, that had a receiver with 1+ yard of separation, right? You can keep on adding all of these really excellent elements on top of it. You can say, hey, I want to look for every 5-step drop that a quarterback has had against cover 2. And you can pull that up. And it's like, well, I want to look for that on third down. Well, I want to look for that when there's a blitz. Well, I want to look for that when they've got 3 receivers on the field, 1 tight end, 1 back, right? So that almost all teams have that system. So in some sense, every team is using Pro Football Focus to some capacity, but I don't think that they're using that grading. In fact, when I was talking to an offensive line coach a couple of years ago about this, first of all, that offensive line coach, Paul Alexander, huge fan of PFF, loves PFF, and loves it so much that he decided to begin auditing PFF grades using a network of coaches and former coaches to make sure that the PFF grades were accurate. I think they just call it the Coach Network or something like that. Really cool element that I think not a lot of people know about when they're talking about PFF grades. Like they've got like former NFL players grading stuff for them, like Bruce Gradkowski, right? They've got somebody who ended up being hired by the Rams as a quarterbacks coach like Zach Robinson, right? So like they've got NFL people in the building, right? So anyway, I think that actually PFF is using a grading system similar to what coaches and scouts have used for a long time, not the other way around. Now, as for the high PFF grades, draftable players are just going to have higher PFF grades. I would not shock me if most draft classes were constructed of people that the majority of them were 74 plus in their PFF grade. Like it's just like you don't draft the worst college football players unless you're the Vikings drafting Willie Beavers. Like that's the only one he was just bad in college, and wow, he was bad in the NFL. But
what a very specific example.
He had the worst pass blocking efficiency by 3 different scouting organizations, right? SIS, PFF, and then there's a third one that existed at the time that no longer exists. That found all of the pass blocking efficiencies for every tackle in FBS, not just draftable, but every tackle. And he was the worst. So, I had my issues with that pick. But yeah, you don't draft bad college players. You draft good college players because they're the only ones that give you a chance of finding good NFL players. So you're going to find guys with 74 plus grades. So I think that's just kind of not even a coincidence. It's just kind of a confounding factor. That said, the grading system can often be somewhat similar. You are looking for wins and losses and pluses and minuses, and you are looking for consistency. And so you will end up using the plus-minus system that is the backbone to the PFF system. The PFF system does some additional math on top of it to produce your 0 to 100 rating, but it is ultimately a plus-minus system. So no, I don't think that they've got a grading similar system PFF. If anything, it's the other way around. PFF is a grading system similar to them, and it is just a coincidence.
Let's go to Jack Angus, who asks, were there any specific trends that you saw with the picks? Something that we usually don't see for the Vikings.
All right, so somebody posted on Reddit, and then Nick Olson responded in that Reddit thread saying that actually he noticed it first and that guy was stealing his posts. I don't know what the answer to that is. I suggest you check out the Reddit thread because Nick was extremely funny in responding to this person.
Really, that needs to be used more often for just about every online argument.
Yeah, killed it. I have no idea if he's right, but like from an audience perspective, he killed it.
Yeah, we want him to be right, if nothing else, as a result of his argument.
Exactly. But the thing that Nick Olson and this other guy maybe noticed was that the Vikings seem to have prioritized the 10-yard split, which is interesting because that had not become a part of the data mining that I had done in anticipation of the draft, right? Based off of like the data from the Rams and the Browns and the Broncos for the offensive and defensive players. So I'm just going to list it off. Again, credit to Nick Olson, credit to this guy on Reddit that I'm going to link. Let's get his name out there. Username Battle to Heaven.
Sure, why not?
I think I'm going to take Nick's side. Battle to Heaven. Come on, man. So Lewis Seen had a 99th percentile 10-yard split. Nick also additionally noted that Seen had the best 10-yard split in the class at safety. Booth didn't test, but he's constantly been described as having quickness and athleticism. Ingram, 99th percentile 10-yard split. That is actually surprising to me. I would not have guessed that, but you look at 40 times, sometimes you don't see the 10-yard split and have a good context for it. So there is that. Let me see something really quick if I can find the original tweet from Nick too, so I can get. Does he say Ingram? Yeah, Ingram 99th percentile. Brian Asamoah 97th percentile 10-yard split. Caleb Evans 84th percentile. Sezi Odamewo 87th percentile when you grade him as a defensive tackle, as opposed to a defensive end where he's 57th percentile. Ty Chandler 99th percentile 10-yard split. Vidarian Lowe 90th percentile, which that one's interesting too because his 20 was not great and his 40 was bad. Jalen Naylor 94th percentile 10-yard split. Again, that one's curious because of his track background, but fine. Nick Muse 82nd percentile 10-yard split. And then either Nick or this guy or both also noted that the two edge undrafted free agents, Zach McLeod and Luigi Villan, God, Luigi villain, man. I hope he makes the team.
I just envisioned the Mario Kart thing where all of a sudden like the like super bassy music plays after he like throws a shell and he's looking back, throwing shade. Like I just envisioned that.
That's perfect. McLeod had an 89th percentile and Villain had a 98th percentile 10-yard split. So that seems to be a trend, right? That seems to be the trend. I would also say that they are matching some of the trends from the other regimes that they came from. I think Asamoah, for example, is a good example of a player who kind of fits that mold. Chandler is a player that's a late round running back. They're probably just going to draft one of those guys every year from now on. Those trends are probably going to continue. That one is the most interesting because it strikes me as the strongest. This does occur sometimes with other teams. The Falcons for a while were obsessed with the broad jump. The Patriots for a while were obsessed with the 3-cone. They eventually, decided not to, but for a while they were quote unquote overdrafting players with those characteristics.
All right, next question is going to be from Vikes Van 33. Arif, do you expect any of these guards on the Vikings roster to move over to center and compete with Bradbury?
I wouldn't so Wyatt Davis was cross training at center. I don't expect that to be a legitimate center competition for him. And obviously, I don't expect like Austin Schlottman or Josh Sokol to be a really great competition for Bradbury out of the gate. So it's just like Chris Reed. I don't see it. Jesse Davis. I do see it potentially. I don't see it with Ed Ingram, although he is supposed to be like smart enough to play center. So maybe that's a possibility. I don't think that there's a lot of center. Oh, and Kyle Hinton, I didn't mention him. I don't think that there's a lot of center talent to actually meaningfully compete with Bradbury at the moment, but it could be wrong. Certainly you can move an interior offensive lineman even further to the interior and teach them to snap. So if they've got, really quick hands, which is a really important element of a center, and they've got great diagnosis ability for identifying fronts and blitzes, they've got good awareness, certainly the Vikings would consider that.
Next question is going to be from Burrito Bill, who asks, what day-to-day activities do you think football analytics could be most usefully applied to?
Nothing. Go outside.
Emmanuel I love this next username, by the way. It hurts.
That's really good. But yeah, this is good.
Emmanuel Kant Anthony Edwards. What are the biggest changes in player athleticism / profile between the Kwesi and Spielman regimes?
So far, it very much seems like the Spielman regime at offensive line did want smaller players than the Kwesi regime wants. They've gotten a bit bigger along the offensive line. Again, they only added like 2 offensive linemen, right? So we don't really have a great understanding of trends, but that's something to kind of keep in mind. We should incorporate our understanding of Chris Reed and Jesse Davis into that as well. So it's not 100%, but that's something to keep in mind. The 10-yard split again stands out. I would think that as we get more data about the receivers that they target, we'll get a better understanding of if they prefer different things at receiver. But for now, it very much seems like they're kind of targeting the same kind of guy. But when it's like a 5th or 6th round pick, there's like not a ton of data to go off of there. But yeah, I mean, like they both trade down a lot. They both see kind of the same spots in the draft as having like the money, like the sweet spot, right? I guess Spielman is a little bit more aggressive about trying to find guys that will replace somebody that has a year left on their contract, whereas Kwesi is just either trying to find guys that fill a need now, like Booth, or is just, they perceive them as just like a really good player, like Evans, for example, which I guess he fills a need now because he plays the same position as Booth, but like, I wouldn't expect Evans to start if Booth is healthy, right? So, for Evans, it's just like, yeah, he's a good player, we could use him, right? Chandler, hey, he's a good player, we could use him. But Spielman would be a little bit more aggressive at making sure that the running back that they get might be somebody that replaces Madison long term, as opposed to somebody who's kind of like a scat back like Chandler, or make sure that hey, we've got this cornerback, we've got this safety with 1 year left, so we're going to like Cameron Bynum to Xavier Woods, right? Or, famously Mike Hughes to Trey Waynes and stuff like that. So that seems to be kind of the difference. But again, we're going to need a couple more drafts before we can really tease apart the differences that they have.
Next question is going to be from Ryan, who asks, if you had to hitch your wagon to one day 3 pick as, quote, your guy moving forward, who would it be and why?
Let's go like super homer on this one. Let's go Otomewo, right? Like, why not? I know I like dinged the pick a lot because he's like old, right? But whatever, fine, cool. He's a gopher. Let's go.
Like it's time. The time is now.
It's time.
Also, if 20 spots in the first is worth a 3rd round pick and 19 spots in the second is worth a 2nd round pick, what is 18 spots in the 3rd worth?
I mean, a 3rd round? Like, I guess it's a 3rd round pick. I don't know. If this feels like a trap question, even though it's really just a pointed question. A 3rd. So I guess first. I guess it's a 1st round pick, right? Based off of the pattern. Well, I feel like I'm failing an IQ test right now.
Well, it all depends on what the Bears are willing to give you at that point.
Yeah. But yeah, if you move up 18 spots in the 3rd round, you better be willing to give up a 1st.
Darn shame that didn't end up happening, but you endeavor to persevere. Andrew asks, did Kwesi really lose draft day trading that badly? Does anyone quantify something like an aggregate net wins above replacement value over all the trades each team made over the draft?
Yeah, I'll link to either a PFF thread on it, or hopefully Timo turn it into an article. I'll link to an article which will hopefully put it all together. If not, I'll link to, I know that that Spielberger Fitzgerald put together one over the cap. So I'll link to an article in the show notes for that.
Next question is going to be from Dr. Aaron Matson. He asks, what are Arif's thoughts on the scouts being made available to discuss the draft picks? It seems like the new regime is committed to at least giving the appearance of being more transparent. Do you think this will continue even if things don't go well this year?
From my end, I thought it was great. From the organizational end, I guess, the perspective from the organization, I think there are some benefits and some disadvantages. The disadvantages are, hey, this guy talked about mid-zone a little bit. They kind of wanted to keep that quiet. That's a little bit, whatever. But on the top end, it gives those guys a moment to be proud of the thing that they did to help the team, right? It puts a highlight or a spotlight on some of the people who did the most important grunt work to get that player into the building, right? And I think that having that kind of reward, and being able to explain your thought process publicly, maybe even help you in terms of your ability to kind of move up, give you some media training and stuff like that, that's important to have. I think that that's good. I think that generally speaking, it's nice to give those scouts a spotlight and identify those scouts and reward them. Now, maybe some scouts don't want to talk to the media, and that is not a reward. But my understanding is that, yeah, it seemed to be. Plus, it gives us a better context and framework for some of the questions that we're going to constantly have. Like, we asked, like, hey, so you said Vederian Lowe has some outside-inside flexibility that he can play both tackle and guard. When you see somebody who only played tackle in college, how can you determine that guy has guard flexibility if they've never taken a snap on the field at guard? And he answered that question, which is really nice. And they talked about, using the GPS data that they have, which is really important for a player like Jalen Naylor, right? That is really good context for us to have to better understand what the team's thought process was, and probably more likely than not, treat the team better in terms of trying to figure out how their draft went, right? Because instead of saying, hey, on this consensus board, it says that this guy was ranked 181 and you picked him at 150. That's wild, right? You can also get, yeah, but they didn't think that there were any kick returners left. And this is really important to try and find a guy that can really challenge a kick returner. Plus, they thought that, one of the reasons that he fell so far in the draft was the 40-yard dash, but our GPS data says that that's actually not an issue. So you can be a lot more, forgiving to a team if you have the data that the team has. They can tell their side of the story in a more concrete way.
Let's go to Zen Cupid, who asks, who is the undrafted free agent that we should all irrationally attach our fandom to and threaten to riot if we perceive them to not be getting a fair shake in training camp? It's got to be
Luigi Villain.
It has to.
Yeah, it's Luigi Villain. No notes.
Perfect. 10 out of 10. Highly recommend. Nolan Kaler asks, for Norse Code, which of the Canadian players will the Vikings regret not choosing?
They like just signed a Canadian player, right? Like one of their undrafted free agents was a Canadian, I think. From like, let's see, Ottawa. I'm gonna search Ottawa inside Dane Brugler's giant draft report.
I thought you were searching to see whether or not Ottawa was part of Canada for a moment. That actually was the better moment for me.
Actually, Luigi Villain. He's from Ottawa.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. Okay. See, we're fine. Everyone's fine. We're fine.
Also, who will be the biggest bust from this draft and realize their true northern calling to become a superstar at the, quote, superior game?
Luigi Villain. I think his last name is pronounced Villain. Whatever.
No, I think that's if it was pronounced like that, I'm pretty sure it would be from a different province. And they don't really like that province as far as I can tell. So
fair enough.
Yeah, let's go with that. I like how Luigi is the answer for both of these. Let's go to PMH, who asks, isn't it likely that the Lions will squander Jameson Williams' talent and that Kwesi took this into account with some sort of analytical wizardry on par with the Twitter algorithm that is able to correctly associate Arif with the Seattle Seahawks?
Well, come on, man. What? That doesn't even make that came out of nowhere. That's not related. You just said it.
That was a hell of a stray you caught there.
No, I would not. I would not make draft moves based off of the assumption that the other guy is going to mess up the draft move. I think that's generally a way to lose pretty big. I think the Lions are probably screwed up.
I was going to say, if the team is going to do it,
you can't like dare them not to do it. Like, you can't assume it's just like, well, like after you do something, you're like, well, at least it's the Lions. I think is the way to think about it, instead of we should do this because it's the Lions, right? Because then they're not going
to contend anyway. It'll be fine.
Right. But like the problem is the Lions will go 1-16 and their one win will be because Jameson Williams caught a 40-yard touchdown, right? That's what happens.
It'll end
against the Vikings.
Yeah, naturally, yeah. It'll be like last year. The Vikings
right, okay, yeah, actually, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, who are the Vikings to say the Lions are screw-ups? Honestly.
At this point, all things are possible. Luke Braun's dad asks, how do I tell my son that the kids that copy off him in math class all failed the grade?
Okay, so I gotta know, did Luke Braun also fail? Because if he didn't, but they did, rare boss move from Luke Braun.
That's some 3D chess right there.
That's cool. Yeah, I had a friend who was considering doing that because the person who turned out to be my roommate later was cheating off of her in econ, but she was like, this is like too much work to like go back and change my answers again. So
like it's just not worth it. Just call it good.
We'll just both pass. It's fine. I don't care.
An A for one of us is an A for all of us.
Yeah.
What a revolutionary concept! Is that where we came up with the Norse
in Code? Econ class of no less, right?
We're on this. That is amazing. Let's go to Tep, who asks, how mad should we be if either Jameson Williams or Christian Watson end up being fantastic NFL players?
You don't got to worry about the Christian Watson thing. I guarantee it. But otherwise, I don't know. Like, what if Booth turns out to be a fantastic player? Like, I don't like how it's all relative, right? Like, if Lucene and Andrew Booth turn out to be phenomenal players, and Jameson Williams and Christian Watson both end up being phenomenal players, like what level of mad do we get? Probably not that mad, right? Like, crap. We gave them an opportunity to get that, but probably wouldn't have drafted Scene at 12. So, who knows? Like, ideally in that situation, I guess if you can envision the future and you think of Scene as like this incredible player that's going to be the top safety in the class, then you draft him at 12 and deny the Lions Jameson Williams, And then, oh no, you don't get Ed Ingram, but you still probably get to draft Andrew Booth. And you just miss out on Ty Chandler. Oh no. And the Packers don't get, I mean, the Packers still might, because they might trade up with whoever at 34, but let's say the Packers don't get Christian Watson in this scenario. Cool. So like, I guess there's like a way to view, but like, honestly, it really just depends on how the Vikings, how those players who they traded for also end up doing.
A lot of people who get upset at like how their team, like, oh, we missed out on this player like 2 years later, with the rare exception of every quarterback that was taken after Mitch Trubisky, which is still just hilarious. Every time somebody complains about that sort of thing, it reminds me of people who complain about how poorly they played a game on The Price is Right. Like all things were relative at that particular moment.
Right.
Like
right.
there was a range going on, and there were things going on outside of your control. Like you just have to accept a certain amount of this is random and luck and like working into your scheme. But really, there's too many factors in play for you to sit there and go, man, we could have had it. There's a good chance you couldn't have. Because your team would have had to trade up and do X, Y, and Z, and then you probably wouldn't have been able to get that piece as well. Like, none of these things happen in a vacuum. And it's important to remember that, especially as Vikings fans, as we watch other drafts happen and they end up being successful, and meanwhile the Vikings are stuck at like 9-8 again.
Yeah.
Like, none of this stuff is in a vacuum. After that rant, let's go to Ricardo, who asks, given how badly the draft industrial complex misjudged this QB class, I was wondering some things. First, given that the QB is the most important position, it stands to reason that evaluating QB would be the most important part of draft scouting. With this in mind, being this far off on the QB class seems like a pretty damning indictment of the entire draft industry. I was wondering if you could think of any mistakes in other careers that are equivalent. A chef trying to pass off a McDonald's as a fine dining meal, for example. Second, I can't recall a year where everyone was so off on so many players. Is this recency bias? Can Arif's previous boards give us some context?
The ones that we focused on, like Nakobe Dean, the quarterbacks, Andrew Booth, are the ones that we focused on, right? We just like pay attention to their fall and their slide, and we talk about it a lot. But that happens every single year. Every single year, some random second, possibly third round player gets drafted into the first round, often by the Seahawks. And we're like, what happened here? That's very strange. I can't believe it. One of the Edmonds, I think it was Terrell Edmonds, was not a very well-regarded prospect. Terrell and Tremaine Edmonds were both in the same draft, and one of them was really well-regarded and one was not. Both were drafted in the first round. And I believe it was the Steelers' Edmund that was the surprise. Maybe it was the Bills' Edmund, in which case it's kind of funny because the Bills' Edmund is the good one. But that one was a several round reach. Quincy Williams in the second round was a several round, or like an entire draft's reach. This just happens, right? The consensus board is always like quote unquote wrong in terms of the fact that there's always going to be someone that gets reached on in the first round, and always somebody that falls every single time. Now, like 3, maybe 2 people fell pretty dramatically. Malik Willis and Nakobe Dean, but that is not shocking. It happens every year. Let me pull up a 2021 consensus big board example if I can find one. Let's see, consensus big board 2021. You ended up with, like, Justin Fields fell a little bit, of course. Trey Lance was a little bit overdrafted. Kwesi Paye fell. He was like 15th, right? He ended up falling. Caleb Farley fell. Yeah, obvious reasons. Nobody was all that concerned. Jalen Phillips, I believe, fell quite a bit, if I remember correctly, because I'm just looking at the board and I'm trying to remember the draft position. He fell to 18, so maybe not him. But yeah, I mean, this happened. Tevin Jenkins fell to the second round. He's graded as number 21. Christian Barmore fell into the second round. He was ranked 26. So yeah, I mean, this sort of thing does happen every year. It's not shocking to me. It's just we we focus on it at the time of the draft, and it becomes a story. And we're like, how could this happen? How could so many people get things so wrong? And it's like, because that always happens, man. It's the nature of the game is that we're not going to be very good at predicting this sort of stuff. So sure, yeah, like Alex Leatherwood was a huge reach. Where was he on the board? Because he got drafted in the middle of the first round, and he was number 45. Like that's a pretty big reach at 17, right? Let's see, Jameen Davis actually was pretty well regarded, so maybe that's not a good example. Jameen Davis was 38, and he was drafted at 19. Yeah, I mean, like, none of this is like hugely shocking to me. Peyton Turner is a really good example. He got drafted at number 28, and he was ranked 60th on the board. Tryon Shiinka, 48th, drafted 32nd. So, like, yeah, all of these reaches happen. A lot of these falls will happen a lot of times. It's never hugely out of order for this sort of thing to happen. Like Trevin Merrick falling out of the first round, that kind of just happens sometimes. I'm sure there's some other ones in 2021, but like for the most part, like it's not that a bunch of experts got things unusually wrong this year. It's just that they were wrong at players that people liked a lot. So, like Jesse Williams fell all the way to the 5th round, I remember, because of an undisclosed knee injury. Yeah, like the consensus board actually did, I think, better. And again, this is just a feeling, so maybe I'm wrong when I do an evaluation of it. But the consensus board actually, I think, was better than it typically is this year. So, I don't know, the experts were more right than they usually are.
Let's go to the gaming nerd who asks, we always hear about how important the QB position is for a team, but what are the top 3 positions behind the QB where it's also incredibly important to have the top end talent in today's NFL?
So I'm moving a little bit off of positional value, just a little bit in terms of where I sit on players. If you have a unique player that is heads and shoulders above the rest of the competition, they kind of defy this positional expectation. Those would be what people envision Kyle Pitts to become. Aaron Donald is a good example of that. And I don't know, maybe Luke Kuechly at his peak when he was playing would be a good example of that. So that aside, linebacker is not typically a very important position, but that aside, I would say that typically you get more wins for value above replacement based off of the research that PFF has done, based off of my exploration of the stuff, which is not nearly as sophisticated, but I promise I did it, would be wide receivers, the second most important position. So, for example, the Bengals were right to grab Jamar Chase instead of Penei Sewell, which they turned out to be mega right. I mean, it helps that Jamar Chase was extremely good and Penei Sewell was mostly good. But, it was the other way around. I think that they still probably would have been right. So wide receiver, and then probably cornerback, safety. Tight end is remarkably not important, again, unless you've got like a Pitts type player. Tackle is really important. I would say the tackle, from my understanding, is a little bit more important than edge rusher. But that's what it seems to be based off of the data that we've been able to gather. It goes quarterback, receiver, cornerback, and then after that, maybe safety, maybe tackle, which is like pretty unusual because typically you'd think, well, it's like the safety is the furthest away from the ball and the tackle is really close to the ball. It's kind of weird that they're somewhat similar, but that is my understanding of kind of where you want to be.
Ollie asks, why are PED suspensions so short compared to a betting suspension where the player isn't even on the roster?
I mean, okay. The betting stuff is because there is an implication of fixing or corruption that runs at the very core of the game that is material to the way the game is operated and structured, right? Like if a player is using PEDs and becoming better, all he does is he becomes better at the game of football in, I guess, an unfair way, but he does not make it impossible for others to stop him, right? If you're involved in gambling, it is very similar to being close to paying refs and stuff like that. And if you do that, there's like nothing, right, that you can do when a ref is paid off. There's nothing that you can do to help win the game and overcome it, right? A PED is a somewhat of a small force multiplier, whereas the worst examples of gambling alter the structure of the sport itself. That's one. Two, PED interacts with and interrupts like the integrity of the internals of the game. Gambling affects an industry outside of the sport itself as well, which is the gambling industry. And so it has an impact on another industry. So that's probably why. But like, you know, if you just compared what Calvin Ridley did to what Nuke Hopkins did, like you'd think like, yeah, dude, like Nuke Hopkins should be suspended for much longer than Calvin Ridley. Like that's nuts. But in terms of the implications of the various activities that they engaged in, the Calvin Ridley stuff has the potential to be much, much larger and involve like federal investigation.
There are certain leagues that have never really been able to shake the past of gambling and their, say, refs specifically. There are allegations that have come out, and what the NFL doesn't want is a situation that happened with the NBA with a fellow by the name of Tim Donaghy, who was a ref who was heavily implicated in a whole lot of potentially fixing games and potentially like ignoring calls due to gambling. And they absolutely do not want this. If you wanted to like go down the conspiracy route, an entire like league championship was basically decided by this fellow by keeping another team out in like some really shady calls. So the NFL wanting to keep all potential like impropriety out. You can't do this. And plus they're making an example of him. Like they have to. He's the first guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Like there's no other way to put it. This is what's just going to end up happening. Maurice Moth asks, where would Case Cookus have been drafted?
First overall. Next question.
Boy, that was such a beautiful throw too. That he had this weekend.
That post, oh my god! It really sucks that his defense let him down, honestly, because he had they'd allowed it. They created a comeback opportunity. Admittedly, he missed a throw in the red zone, but his receiver did drop a pass in the end zone anyway. So it's one or the other, right? But yeah, like there's just like couldn't get off the field when New Jersey was just running the ball and clocking out, and just did not give Case Cookus a chance to lead that comeback. It's really unfortunate because he had a really great game.
My question is, why on earth is the other quarterback following you on Twitter now?
I don't know. This is like a crisis right now in terms of like my bits.
Like you have to think that if he comes onto Twitter, he's at some point you're going to go through one of your Case Cookus moments and like fill everyone's timeline with it. And his timeline too will be affected. And he's got to feel the breath of Case Cookus already upon his neck. Like he knows that Case Cookus is coming for his job.
He's got to. I mean, maybe that's why, like, maybe it's like sort of like pleading to whatever fell god that you can get access to. Like, oh, who started the Case Cookus memeing? Is it this guy? Can he save me? The answer, Brian Scott, is no.
Maybe it's like the Tiki God thing. He's just trying to find out who he needs to destroy in order to have success here. I may be referring to you as some sort of a Hawaiian Tiki God. I don't... I'll take it. This is not the worst thing I have called you on the show. Let me be perfectly clear. Dusty asks, excluding baldness for obvious reasons, can you ever trust anyone whose hair is the same length all over their head?
No. That's a crazy haircut.
It's every time Mark Davis appears on TV, somebody has to do something. Like he can go off and build his Star Destroyer out in the desert and just, leave him alone. But somebody has to do something about that hair. Just terrible.
Yeah, brutal.
Oh, Dusty also asks, most Vikings 9 Inch Nails song. Something I Could Never Have, Happiness and Slavery, or Eraser. I'm going to go with either Every Day Is Exactly the Same or Help Me, I'm in Hell. Based on some of these terrible draft and or playoff moments. And Kenneth Allen, let's end on a quasi-Dusty question. Kenneth Allen asks, I recently saw someone post an amazing picture of Ethiopian crossed with Texas barbecue fusion. And now I'm wondering what other barbecue cuisine mashups would also be amazing.
So first of all, Dusty had an awful take that he just hates fusion cuisine. So we asked him about Korean barbecue tacos. I think, right? Like that was
yes, that's what said that's what invoked the fury of the wizard.
And like those are like unquestionably good. Like you can't like that stops the argument. Like fusion food is not universally bad. Here, have a Korean barbecue taco. Done. End of story.
Enjoy this tortilla. It has kimchi in it. Live with it.
Yeah, right. Like you're set for life now. But yeah, I mean, other barbecue cuisine mashups, that'd be interesting. I assume you mean American barbecue mashing up with another type of cuisine. So I cannot use, for example, the Korean barbecue taco as a great example, although that is a great example. You could put brisket in so many things that, like, I've had, actually, very recently, I was at High-Low Diner, which puts smoked barbecue brisket into Mexican cuisine breakfast food. Like, it's incredible. Like in like a hash that has like bell peppers and onions, and I don't know. It's so phenomenal that I think my answer is going to be extremely close to where American barbecue is popular. It's going to be Mexican food. But honestly, you could just put brisket in so many things that it just like works. So it's difficult to find a cuisine that's not going to have use for at least one element of this sort of thing. And I'm going to say that like the slow cooking element of like a birria taco, which I had today, by the way, is not too dissimilar anyway from a lot of the slow cooking that occurs in barbecue. So there's marriages waiting to happen here that I'm sure have already happened, given how close those food regions are anyway.
Vietnamese would be interesting too. I think Vietnamese would be quite an interesting idea for a number of reasons. I will say though,
I think it would go really well in pho. I think it would go really well in banh mi's.
Yep.
In fact, like char siu already does well in banh mi's. This is like not that far removed from char siu.
Yeah. I will say that after spending a week in North Carolina, I am saddened greatly by the fact that everywhere I eat now no longer has hush puppies for the table. Like that was just a staple that existed for like the first 3 restaurants that we went to. It was like, this is just, oh yeah, here's just some hush puppies for the table. Just like, oh my God, why is this not everywhere? Why is not every cuisine everywhere in the country doing this? This is yes. Just so perfect.
Yes.
Weddings, funerals, bar mitzvahs, kinsara, everything. Everything is better with this fried bread as a side. It's perfect. All right, that's going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you enjoyed the Dusty special where we went 2 parts on this. Reef, where can they find your work?
Yeah, you can find me over at theathletic.com/author/Arif-Hassan. I'll endeavor to have a film and statistical breakdown of Lou scene, and hopefully I'll have some other ones in the pipeline, including Andrew Booth, Ed Ingram, and Brian Asamoah. So that'll be that. And then we may have a discussion about like Viking scheduling. That'll come up. That'll be over at The Athletic as well.
So check that out. Hopefully we've got some cool stuff to announce here in the next couple of days. So for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember the Vikings are not to be trusted. And we'll be back soon. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, and wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan of The Athletic, and he can be found at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at Norse Code DN, or my personal account at Big Mono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can do so in a few different ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. For $3.50 a month, you get bonus material and more. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode for a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and pick up some Norse Code merchandise. Any questions or comments that cannot fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this.
All things are possible through the power of Ben DiNucci.